When we look up the casualty list for different World War II Pacific Island battles, there's something that strikes you right off. The Japanese fought to almost the last man. There are very few Japanese taken alive as POWs. Why is this? In the Battle of Tarawa, the United States invaded with 35,000 troops against over 4,800 Japanese defenders. There were 1,009 Americans killed in action, but a whopping 4,690 KIA for the Japanese. Only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers made it out alive as POWs. That's almost every single defender. We'll run through some more Pacific battles as examples and look at the data further. Once again, the American invaders attacked with over 46,000 troops against the 5,000 plus defenders, which gave the Americans over a 9-to-1 advantage in men. As you can see below, there were only 49 Japanese soldiers who surrendered and 125 Korean laborers. It's a military maxim that you shouldn't attack unless you have at least a minimum of a 3-to-1 advantage, but it's much better to have a 5-to-1 advantage. The United States had a 9-to-1 advantage, with overwhelming naval and air power and a seemingly limitless supply of ammunition. Here we see that only 224 Japanese soldiers became POWs, which is a little over 6%. As the United States got closer to the Japanese home islands, the Imperial Japanese Army started raising the stakes for every island, every battle, with more troops and fiercer resistance. In Saipan, the Japanese had almost half the amount of the attackers. 5,000 Japanese troops committed suicide and only 921 became POWs. Notice that the Japanese didn't have wounded or missing soldiers. There are a few reasons for this, and we'll get to that in a bit. On Guam, there were a lot more POWs taken. It's uncertain why this broke the pattern somewhat, but most of the island garrison was still wiped out. While logistics and weight of numbers may indicate an inevitable Allied victory in island battles, particularly later in the war, this does not explain why well-embedded, predominantly high-morale troops with carefully designed defensive plans and structures almost always fared worse than invading forces. Only 313 of the defending 9,000 troops lived to see another day. What's the explanation for this? It's not as if the Imperial Army had not had ample training and experience, and while Japanese armor was weak and in short supply, artillery and gun emplacements are far more important in defensive tactics, and these the Japanese Imperial Army seemed to have plenty of. Only 400 Japanese surrendered out of the original 14,000 defending troops. Beyond a doubt, no nation in World War II had soldiers of such fanatical devotion in her service as Japan did. On Iwo Jima, most of the POWs captured were from the Imperial Japanese Navy. There were a large amount of supporting IJN personnel fighting in a combat role in this battle. By the time the United States invaded Okinawa, both sides knew that this would be a foretaste of the invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. The Japanese were trying to show that invading Japan would cost too much blood and treasure. The Americans were equally resolved to conquer the land that attacked Pearl Harbor on that fateful day in December 1941. On Okinawa, the IJA was able to supplement their troops with Okinawan conscripts. These did not have the heart to die for the emperor like the Japanese soldiers around them. Most of the POWs taken were Okinawans. So, back to the original question, why were there so few Japanese POWs in World War II? Japanese forces were by no means inferior to their enemies in terms of fighting spirit or training. Early Japanese overwhelming victories relied upon the quality and training of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen rather than the quality of their weapons. The early battles with the United States resulted in the loss of many veteran Japanese soldiers and airmen, creating a shortage of superbly trained soldiers. Japanese forces were badly armed compared to their adversaries. There were two standard rifles, the Arisaka Type 38 and the newer Type 99, both of which were bolt action. Some Japanese veterans envied the higher effective rate of fire of American rifles. For example, the average U.S. soldier could fire 8 rounds as quickly as he could pull the trigger, without having to move his hands on the rifle or disrupt his firing position and point of aim. Because Japanese rifles used different ammunition, it caused supply problems. The Japanese lagged far behind the Allies in terms of artillery and armored vehicles. Most of their machine guns were notoriously unreliable. They didn't do much counter-battery fire. Due to its lack of prestige, only 4% of Japanese military academy graduates entered the logistics corps. Soldiers suffered because of this, whether due to lack of food, ammunition, equipment, or medical care, thereby escalating the wounded death rate. The tropical terrain of the Pacific theater was especially unforgiving. Diseases were common, and in some instances, due to lack of food, soldiers turned to cannibalism. When all hope was lost and most soldiers would surrender under a tactically impossible situation, the Japanese would attack, either with a banzai charge in the early years, or modified, quiet sneak attack. The result was an all-out slaughter. Some of the Japanese who became prisoners were unconscious or wounded to the point where they couldn't pull the pin on a grenade and blow themselves up. Sometimes they ran out of ammunition and simply couldn't fight back. Rarely, there was the Japanese soldier who saw the futility of the fight and surrendered. Many of the Okinawans and Korean laborers weren't willing to fight to the end. This shows that the Japanese sometimes could have surrendered, but chose death for the emperor. Some supplementary facts are in 2 of my videos, the most excellent, Fight to the Death, the story of the 109th Japanese Division at Iwo Jima, parts 1 and 2, and also my other video, Island Hopping, which gives facts about how the Allies were able to take control of the Pacific so quickly. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. If you liked what you see, hit the subscribe button or share. Thank you. This has been EmersusTech.